Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panelists for Solving for Gen X, High Achievers and the New Midlife Crisis, moderated by Senior Research Scientist at the Center for Creative Leadership, Jennifer Deal.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. This should be a very interesting panel. I'm going to tell you who everybody is, and then we're going to show you a video. So this panel came about because of an article that was written by Ada Calhoun. This is Matthew Hennessey. This is Susan Krauss Whitbourne and Danica Lo. And Ada had written an article about Gen X midlife crisis that got a big response from people. And so we'd like to show you a little bit of a video about that. If you could start it now, please. So you can see the response that it received, and Danica was one of the first people to tweet about it. So we'd like to start discussing this topic by asking Danica. So, what got that kind of response from you?
Hi, I'm Danica. I'm 40 and I'm the digital director at Food and Wine, and I have never done any professional work or any research on Gen X or having a midlife crisis. But, so when Paul from Milken called me, I was like, how did you find me? And he said he saw this video. I was like, how do people know I'm having a midlife crisis? He said he saw this Oprah video. And I was like, what Oprah video? And then I looked at it and I was like, oh, I fully remember this story. So I found Ada's story on Oprah, the O Magazine website, probably through my own Twitter or through my own Facebook feed. And when I read it, I felt like I was reading about myself and my life and about my friends and about their lives. And it was like a 6,000-word story. And I feel like all of my friends read every single word of it. And every single word was like hitting the nail on the head. It was all there. I think we all really empathized with the feeling of, you know, the overwhelming stress and the underlying frustration, the feeling exhausted all the time. Like, I don't even have kids and I'm exhausted all the time. And there are all those things, like the things you mentioned, like just lying there quietly in the dark, like running checklists of like personal disappointments through your head every night. And these were very, very familiar to me and to my peer group and to the women who I interact with in my own echo chamber of social media, which is, to be honest, mostly media professionals. So yeah, there was this really great moment last year where for the first time in my adult life, I saw Generation X women sort of rally around something you had in common. Like there was a moment of community and cohesion that I'd never seen before. To be honest, I'd never even thought about really being Gen X, not since I was like a teenager. But when you really think about it, and you think about those movies that we grew up with in the 80s and 90s, like The Breakfast Club and like Stand By Me, and then later on with like Singles and Reality Bites, all of those themes are still here with us today. And I think the themes have somehow gotten magnified and possibly even worse because I think that we didn't think that that sort of like nihilism and cynicism would still be around with us 20 and 30 years later.
Yeah, so that was the reaction to the article. Ada, what have you found since then? Because you've been continuing to work on this subject.
Yes. So when I was assigned the piece in the first place, my editor at Oprah.com said she thought it was going to get a big reaction because she works around these women all the time, this demographic. But we didn't anticipate what would happen, which was, I think that weekend after it went up, there were something like 300,000 Facebook shares in 2 days. And it was women saying that they felt like seen and that they felt relieved that there were forces at work beyond just their own personal failings, that there were things about the generation that made it harder, especially at midlife, especially for women. So that story doing so well led to a book deal. I'm doing a book for Audible Originals right now. And I'm just seeing all over the country women just really having a hard time at midlife. And I think there are a lot of reasons, which we're going to get into, obviously. But what I think is interesting is that they're being really honest in these interviews I'm doing now. I gave them anonymity, which helps a lot. And I'm just hearing a lot of really moving things.
So what are you hearing that makes this different? I mean, every generation has issues.
Yes.
Every generation goes through midlife. What makes this different?
Yeah, so I'm curious, are people Gen X in this room? If you raise your hand if you're Gen X. Okay, welcome. So, one thing is our childhoods, right? So 4 out of 10 of us had divorced parents. The divorce rate peaked in 1980. That led to a lot of instability and a lot of financial instability in particular. If your dad leaves, it's much less likely that you're going to get college paid for. It was this time, especially for women, where we were told we could do anything. I don't know if anybody remembers the Anjali ad. Do you remember this advertisement? It was like, this sexy woman, and she says, I can bring home the bacon and fry it up in a pan and never let you forget you're a man, right? And it was the fantasy. And I think that one thing I keep hearing is that women were told they could do anything, and that they interpreted that, and I should say we interpreted that as, so we should do everything. And all those possibilities brought a lot of pressure on women. We did a lot to try our best to do it. One thing was waiting to have children. So in 1970, the average age for a first baby was 21. And then now for educated women, like the ones in this room, it's 30. It's a huge difference if you're raising kids, little kids, while trying to lean in at work, taking care of aging parents, and going through perimenopause. It's hard.
So Susan, you've been doing research on this for a while. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I have. I've been studying adult development for most of my adult life, having landed a pretty interesting sample of college students who I began to follow up when they were in their 30s. And I've been following them every 10 years, about 300 people, and every 10 years adding new people. So I have baby boomers, I have Gen Xers, I have everything up to millennials, the famous millennials, and looking to see, is there a midlife crisis? What are the patterns of development through adulthood? And what I have found, and many of my colleagues in the field have found, is that there's no one identifiable age at which everything falls apart, where it all comes crashing in, and then you dabble around down there for a while, and then you pull yourself out. It seems that the midlife concept is overly general. I think when changes occur, they occur in some people at some times, excuse me, for a number of reasons, but they're not linked to age. Age is not a cause of anything. And if we're learning anything about the Gen X women, it's that the pressures on this generation are different than previous generations and the generations to come. It doesn't make them any less, but it doesn't necessarily link them to midlife issues. So when I was asked to be on the panel, I said, oh no, I'll be saying there's no midlife crisis again to people who fervently believe in it, and how is that going to go across with the idea of women who are actually experiencing the stress that you've talked about. And so we don't want to minimize stress, depression, anxiety, all the pressures that people feel. But maybe, in my opinion, the midlife crisis was a misnomer. It wasn't at midlife. It wasn't really a crisis. Discuss, and it just became a really comfortable concept for people, mainly men, to stow their naughty behavior into this midlife crisis bag and say, that's why I'm leaving you all and going off and leaving the family behind. So I don't think it was an appropriate term to begin with, but if we want to have a new midlife crisis, then let's get rid of the term midlife crisis. Come up with your own term that applies more aptly to what the issues that are facing this generation are.
Do you have one that's catchy that I can use for my book?
I think that you've got one here, high-achieving Gen X women, what our lives are. It's probably not the most exciting.
Too long.
Colin, I'm sure you can come up with a better one, or the editors on our panel could. But yeah, I think this is a good title beginning. And I think you do need to change the narrative, because the narrative was about men. It was about men who were approximately 42.75 years old, okay, according to the original study, such as it was. And it was about very different issues, a very different cohort, very different pressures than what women are facing today in this cohort. Extremely different. And also helping, I think, those who will be coming after you, the infamous millennials, will be looking to this generation for inspiration and for ways to help their lives be more happier and more productive.
So speaking about both men and women at this life stage, what do you think is different about things now than, say, before? You write a little bit about the changing way things work.
You're a token man.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm leery of sort of touching the, with all of these smart, eloquent women on the stage. I don't really have much to add to the idea of the women's midlife crisis. I would like to make a couple of sort of points about what's different, even in my life, in all of our lives, is the technology that we're sort of surrounded by and dominated by in a lot of different ways that just wasn't an issue for generations that came before. If there's an anxiety or just a sort of a background sense of unease about how things are going or how things are changing for people who are our age, in their 40s, some of us are touching into our 50s now, I think it must somehow be related to this sense that the world is changing in a way that is sort of vexing at its heart. We don't know what's going to happen, but we do sort of get the sense that whatever world is being created isn't really being created for us. So we're 10 years into the social media revolution. We're only just starting, I think, in 2018, the first half of this year has been a real upsurge in articles and sort of commentary. The Facebook issue is a part of that. People are saying, well, wait a minute, maybe this is not going exactly as we had planned. Let's start tweaking it. Let's start adjusting the direction of this thing before it gets too late. Well, how long is that going to take? It could take another 10 years before you get it right. So the world that is coming into being now is not really being made for Generation X. It's being made for the millennials. And so if there's a sense of, I guess, anxiety, I don't know, what's another word? Ennui, that's a terrible word. But, I think that it must be somehow tied to that. There's just
So the curated lives being part of it.
Yeah, well, you could imagine all the things that are different, like Ada was saying, for my mother when she was raising us. Now just add on top of that this sort of running commentary about how wonderful everybody else's lives are going, and how beautiful their children are, and how beautiful their houses are, and their careers, and it's affecting everybody, not just mothers or families or fathers. It's affecting all of us, and we're adjusting to it, but that adjustment's going to be kind of slow, I think.
So Danica, you spend a lot of time on social media.
I do.
Do you have thoughts on this?
I do. I think I thought about this question when you sent it over to us, and I think what I've noticed is that I have a bunch of people that I know from high school and college who somehow have managed to completely stay off social media. So they're like ungoogleable, they're on Facebook, maybe they're dead, I don't really know. But the people who are on social media, who are in my echo chamber that I talked about, they tend to be a bit younger. A lot of them work in media. The ones who I went to college with and who probably have make a lot more money than I do and are professionals and don't just eat and drink for a living. I do objectively, I think this is one of the weird things about this midlife crisis, or the not midlife crisis, is that objectively I think we know we're doing well. Objectively, I'm pretty sure that my life is more interesting than most of my peers' lives. Because people tell me, they're like, you travel all the time, you go to these great restaurants, you're at the Milken Institute speaking on a panel. So objectively, I know that I'm doing pretty good. So I don't know if it's the curated life thing. What we do know, so I worked in fashion for a long time before I worked in food. And at Glamour, we did a body image survey one year. And it said that we found, after surveying 2,000 women, around a little bit younger than me, probably peaking at 35, so 20 to 35, we found that 68% of women felt worse about themselves after looking at social media than they did, right before looking at Instagram, for example. So I don't feel that way, but I can see where that would come from.
Ada, did you hear about this?
Well, it's funny because when I was working on the Oprah story, I talked to this really smart psychiatrist named Deborah Lupnitz, and she said that one thing that brings all of her Gen X clients to her is the sense of overwhelm and exhaustion. And she said there's always a point at which they say, Sally has it all figured out, and they name their friends or their neighbors who have it just down. Like they're able to have the marriage and the kids and the job and the hot body and like all the things all at once. And what she said, Dr. Lupnitz said, is that all these women are measuring their own insides against other people's outsides. And that there's something about that tension that is really demoralizing. And she keeps trying to reassure them, no, they're just as messed up as you are. Like, look at your outsides. Your outsides look great too. You've got the pictures of your vacation. You've got the Christmas card photo of your kids in matching sweaters. You have those things, and that's what you need to match against their outsides, not your own, inner turmoil.
Yeah. So in your research, has the curated life come up yet?
I've done some looking at the effect of social media on happiness and well-being, and it seems that some people are particularly vulnerable to those damaging effects of comparison. But I think in general, it's probably overemphasized compared to the bonding that you can experience through social media that we never had before, and being able to connect with people. And you decide to curate your own life when you whittle down your Facebook friends to the ones who are really going to help you feel good about what you're doing with your life. But I did want to say in regard to the sort of this idea that there's crisis and stress, which you've articulated extremely well, is that change it can be very good, as we know, and that the people who are probably the unhappiest are the ones who don't look to the right or the left or at any alternatives to the way their lives are playing out now, but the people who just keep doing the same thing over and over again, year after year. In my study, in the search for fulfillment, the book that I wrote based on the study, I found there were these different pathways, and some people made a lot of changes, little tiny ones. Some made some pretty bad changes that didn't go so well, and some managed to conquer adversity in amazing ways, and other people never really figured out who they were. And then there were the ones who were just the straight and narrow, the never changing. And if you want to compare yourself to somebody who's unhappy, and you're feeling unhappy because you're making a lot of changes, those people are definitely unhappier. They're too scared to change. And we don't want to let fear and stress keep us from actualizing our sense of self.
I read your book, I enjoyed it, and I took the quiz. There's a quiz you can take and figure out which path you're on, so I'm on the authentic road, I'm proud to say. And one thing I liked very much about the duty of somebody on the authentic road is really candidly reckoning with the problems in your life and with the issues. And I think that's, for me, this article, and I think for a lot of the readers, it was helpful just to actually sit with all of the problems, just to dwell in it, and look at what it is about our lives that makes them hard. If we're unhappy, why are we unhappy? And I think that's something that just doesn't happen a lot on the internet. Even if you curate your friends, even if you just have a few, there's something sort of alienating about social media in a way that I think our mothers and grandmothers didn't experience with their bridge clubs. And I think that other generations, they had the VFW hall, and they had the Elks, and they had their bowling night. It's a poor substitute to have an Instagram wall with comments.
Matthew?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you can't really have a conversation about Generation X without sort of noting the twin gorillas. I mean, we're kind of like the runt of the litter of American generations.
The neglected middle child, as
yes,
you said.
That's right. And so you have to think about what the baby boomers have, such a gigantic cohort moving through the culture and moving through the economy, and how all of the things that Ada was just sort of describing changed during their tenure, if you like, running things. That's the world that we inherited, but only like for a second. And then the torch is going to get passed right to the millennials. So again, if there's like some sort of atmospheric feeling of like we're getting passed over here, or things aren't happening exactly the way we sort of hoped they would, I would like people to sort of, talk more about Generation X as a real thing, this panel being a nice exception to the general rule, which is that we only ever get mentioned in regard to the movies and music that we leave behind, which I will also point out, for the most part, is kind of grim. Like the music that we're known for liking is just sort of, so there might be something just very melancholy about us naturally. I know a lot of people don't like to hear these kinds of things. Some people don't even think like generations exist. But we have to have these conversations in these terms. So.
Well, and how much of this, one of the things that has come up multiple times, and it came up in your article, is how much of this is a first world problem? How much of this is a real problem? Mm-hmm. Because we're talking about people who are very successful, as you said, all the people you're talking about are very successful, and the issue of looking at people with their outsides, but we're talking about people who are quite successful. Yeah. So how much of this is?
I think it's easy to dismiss, right? It's like all these women that I spoke with who were crying after they dropped their kids off, or who were smoking out the window like they did in high school, or doing all these little acting out things around their very busy lives. They felt guilty for feeling bad. They felt ashamed, and that's why I think we don't talk about it enough, is because, here they were, they had, they live in America, they are free, they do have all these opportunities, they are the best educated generation ever in history of women. And so they have all these advantages, so why do they still feel bad? And there are reasons, and I think it's so valuable to not dismiss it as you shouldn't feel bad, so you must not.
I just have a couple of data points I'd like to insert into the conversation about rates of depression and in this cohort. And about 15 years ago, there was an article showing the rates of depression in different cohorts. And the 18 to 29-year-olds, who would have been Gen X, had the highest rates of depression at that time. So fast forward 2016, and depression rates in women are definitely higher than men, but they go straight down the line in terms of age differences in depression. So it goes from something like 10 to something like 7 to something like 4 in people 50 and older. So Gen X seems to be adjusting itself to what was going on in the 20s. And I think we do see that. I think that people learn to adapt to their issues that they were dealing with in the 20s, and I think sometimes the 20s are the hardest time of all when you think about all the pressures that are going on and all the uncertainties. It's a different set of pressures that you're experiencing in the 40s, but in some ways things will settle down because some of the stresses aren't created by you. Now, you might feel guilty that why am I unhappy when I have all these great things going on, but honestly, you have a lot of pressure. I have a daughter who I ride into Boston with once a week, which that's pretty stressful right there, that little commute. And she's dealing with the kids and the husband and, of course, her job, and then the people at her job, and I'm thinking, this is really rough. She has very little time with her family. So I get to kind of see it firsthand and relive some of my own experiences when I was raising my daughters. But to see, it really objectively is hard. And it's okay to say that it's hard, and you don't have to then add guilt on top of already feeling stressed. But the good news is that the path starts to become clearer as you make your way through these externally induced stresses that will resolve themselves and you'll learn to cope with over time.
I sort of wonder if it's even more specific than just a first world problem. I wonder if it's an American problem. I have a lot of friends, I went to grad school in England, so I have a lot of friends who live in England, who live in Scandinavia, who live like all over Europe. They don't seem to have the same problem. Like I have friends I had a friend who was an editor at a magazine in Finland, and we all know Finland is like this perfect place that's like, full of alcoholism, but like a perfect place. But so I have a friend who was an editor there. She got pregnant, had a baby, went on maternity leave for 2 years, and came back and got her job. So I think there are things that that we are just worrying about now at this age that have crystallized. I think in your 20s, things like maternity leave, it doesn't matter as much, or like, or the idea of home ownership or saving for retirement. Like my friends in Sweden don't have to really worry about saving for retirement. So I think maybe it's just a moment in time added, on top of our natural depressive conditions.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. How much of this do you attribute to the way work works here?
Well, I work in an office, and I guess you work in an office too, right? So, I mean, you work.
I work in an office, yes.
Right,
yes.
yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, and specifically.
I was thinking about Finland.
Yeah. So I think about this all the time because every day even though I'm a director at my brand, I sit in an open plan office, and you have to do so much work. Everything is designed against the creative process and against, the efficiencies of what you should be doing at a media organization. So in order to inure yourself against all the noise and all the people talking and all just the chaos that's going on around you, you have to buy $400 headphones to wear it in your terrible open plan office, and people are slacking you all day long. You cannot get through 15 minutes. And so there are all these things that are designed to work against when I feel like I should be doing my best work. I feel like in my 20s and my 30s, I didn't really know all this stuff, right? And to be a good content creator, to be a good editor, to be somebody who's a good manager and a good team leader, I have to have moments of concentration, and everything is designed against that now. And I blame millennials for the open plan office. I fully blame them. So it's their fault.
A lot of people do.
Yeah.
Did you hear people talk about the structure of work contributing to this malaise?
Yeah, well, I think especially for women, if there is no maternity leave, if there's no leave to take care of your sick parents, and it is usually the women who go home when the kid is sick, it's usually them who take care of grandma when she falls down. So if there's nothing in place for them to continue at their job while dealing with these other things, they often do leave. And when they leave, they join the gig economy and they're freelance like I am. And it's great. You can work, you can choose your 20 hours a day to work. It's fantastic. And here I am. I'm able to pick my kid up from school and drop him off. But I'm also working at 9 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night. I'm working all the time, all the hours. And I think this gig economy, it's sold to women as an advantage, as something great because it lets you do these other things. But the reality is you work twice as hard for half the money.
I don't think it's just the gig economy, though. I work in an office. I work in a very traditional setting. But I'm never not working also because I'm always just an email away in my pocket. The boss, who is a wonderful guy, but we all work in these kind of jobs where you're never really off the clock, even on Saturday morning. If it needs to be done, you've got to do it. If you're at the Little League game or whatever you're doing, that's just to tie it back into my original point. That's not the world we expected to inherit, I don't think, when we were 17, 18, 19 years old. This is the first time I've been in Los Angeles since 1998. And the one thing that I noticed, or that I had a mental picture of in my mind, is that people are walking around like they are everywhere on their cell phones. And if I remember Los Angeles from 20 years ago, I'm not remembering anybody doing that. So it can't help but have an effect on our relationship to our jobs if we're thinking of some sort of father knows best ideal where daddy comes home at 5 o'clock and sits down and has dinner with the kids. That's not my life. That's never going to be my life. I know that's never going to be my life. So we have to sort of adjust to it, but it's a very hard adjustment, I think.
Do you think our generation has a problem with boundaries? I feel like the younger people on my team, they know their boundaries. They're like, I'm not emailing you back after 6 o'clock. I don't care. And I think my parents' generation, my dad came home at 6 o'clock every night, and he didn't have to work after 6 o'clock. I wonder if we have an issue with guilt and boundaries. I don't know.
I think any millennial at the Wall Street Journal who doesn't answer the email after 6 o'clock is not going to be working there for long. And it's not just the Wall Street Journal. It's every company. I mean, there might be the odd company you could find that has a strict policy that, we love you so much that we're going to let you have a life outside of work. But let's be real, that's not happening.
The thing is, even the companies that do have strict policies, the people use their personal email accounts to continue doing work outside of work hours. So it's everywhere. This has been seen all over the place. They don't stop.
I think it's true for all generations, though, sadly. It may be that the reality versus the anticipation has been particularly harsh, but baby boomers have made adjustments, and I'm not defending baby boomers, I'm just saying it's kind of like sucked for everybody in some ways that work has bled into our family lives. But I feel like it's gone so far that now companies are saying this is bad for the mental health of our workers. And we may not be seeing in this country, but I think you're right, in other countries that are saying, look, you need these boundaries. And we want people to be mentally healthy in the workplace. And in order to do that, they need to be able to take their time from home and find ways that work and family can enrich each other. And there's something called a work-family enrichment model, which I think is very wise and says there are resources that you bring to work from family and vice versa. But of course, when it all just spills over and there's no time left, which is what happens, it then becomes unsustainable. But I also would like to point out the importance of individual differences, because I think we're hearing individual stories, which is extremely helpful, and I think in your book it's going to be fascinating to see the stories people tell. And it is important to realize that there's individual differences due to personality, due to social class, race, ethnicity, and a whole host of factors that affect the way people navigate different transitions in life. So I think that, as I said earlier, putting everybody into one category, midlife crisis, does fail to acknowledge the importance of personality and social factors and the interaction of all these factors with changes in physical and cognitive functioning.
Speaking of changes in physical and cognitive functioning,
Yes.
you wrote about this.
Perimenopause.
Yes.
And I confess I didn't even know the term until I started working on the article. It's something that I think is not very fun to talk about. It's not sexy to talk about. But menopause is the same as it always has been. It usually happens around age 51. But the years leading up to that, which can be 7 years or 10 years, are often emotionally difficult. And every gynecologist I've spoken with now, experts at the North American Menopause Society, has told me that there is this real dearth of education in this country about that transition. It takes a long time. It's really hard. It's like puberty, except you're also working full-time raising small children while it's going on. And I think we need to talk about it more.
So the women you were talking to hadn't heard about it? Hadn't read about it?
I hadn't heard about it. I live in New York City. I feel like I go to all my doctor's appointments, and no one had ever said anything like maybe the reason you're not sleeping through the night, or maybe the reason you're a little bit emotionally erratic is because you're entering this zone that women go through in their 40s typically. That's quite difficult.
And oftentimes it isn't presented that way.
No, it's not, and often I think it's mistreated. 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women in this country is on antidepressants, and I can't help but wonder what percentage of those could do better with hormone replacement therapy or lifestyle changes that would combat those perimenopausal problems.
Oh, I totally agree with you on lifestyle changes. I think hormonal is kind of a very weird story with what the data change from day to day, but recognizing that perimenopause exists, there are physical changes, there's emotional changes, and we're finding more and more that exercise, meditation, relaxation, all the things the millennials are getting us to do are actually good for all ages. And rather than taking medication, mindfulness, meditation, relaxation, and behavioral approaches to depression and anxiety can be extremely helpful. And I think one of the good things about this conversation is it gets people to realize that, that constant lump in my throat that I have all the time, because this bad thing happened to me last year and it's never gone away. Okay, it's not going away, but I can do something about it, and I don't have to live like this. And there are very treatable conditions that we know about now and ways to treat that we didn't know about even 10 or 15 years ago, and they do not involve medication.
So before we keep talking, I wanted to find out, do people have questions? Sorry, it's hard to see you. Do you have any questions for the panel? Yes. Oh, we need
There's
a
a mic.
mic. Who has the mic?
Hi. My question is, you touched on it briefly, but I think there's more to explore here about, I feel like your generation got kind of bait and switched. You grew up in an analog world where you could write your college papers on paper with pens, and you entered the workforce and thereafter in a digital world, and you had to, your parents didn't have to do any of that, and your kids are learning how to, hack your iPhone before you can. So, do you guys? Is there any sense that without giving you an excuse here, that there could be a residual impact from having that switch? And if so, does it affect women more than men, or not?
Well, that's kind of my whole thing. It is a kind of it's not a bait and switch. I mean, nobody did it on purpose. It just kind of happened that way. We just fell into that moment where, while we were in our 20s, everything changed. The world that we were expecting just transformed into something else. I think we've done a pretty good job of adjusting to it, but like you said, the millennials have kind of got it sorted, although I hear from millennials sometimes, they get very defensive when I say, like, you don't even remember when the internet didn't exist, do you? Like, throughout your whole life, you've just been able to answer any question you wanted without having to, like, go to the encyclopedias or whatever we had to do. And they say, no, man, I remember when it was like, and I said, no, that's not true. You remember when your parents wouldn't let you go on the internet, but it was there. They don't like that. No, so yeah, that's where I'm coming from generally with all of this stuff. People will, I've noticed, want to fight you about anything to do with generations, from saying they don't even exist to it's your fault or why are you blaming us. It's not an easy conversation to have. I couldn't honestly tell you whether men have it worse than women. I have no idea.
I think, sorry.
I'm sorry, women have it worse.
I think, so my job, because I work in digital media, it didn't exist when I was growing up. And it really didn't exist until, like, content-driven digital didn't really exist until the late, 2006 probably. Like, before that, they were just, like, taking the magazine stuff and putting it on the internet. And then around, like, 2006, that's when it really blew up, like, blogging and all that stuff. That got really, really big. And that's where I work now. Unfortunately, you all know that digital media, there's no sustainable revenue model. It is a disaster, and the whole thing is probably going to go away in the next 5 years. And so I find myself at this point, and I talk a lot with my colleagues about this. A lot of us who are at this level, and we've spent the last 10 years cultivating these careers, when we leave our next jobs, we're not sad because we're leaving a brand or a place. We're sad because we're mourning our careers. These things that we've built up, and now we have to reinvent ourselves again. And print is no better off. I was in print for 7 years, and I was like, I got to get out of print. So I think not knowing what's next, the instability and the uncertainty is always really hard. And I read somewhere, I did a little bit of research before I came on the panel, but I read somewhere about how our generation, our definition of stability is the ability to be mobile and the sort of adaptability. So our generation is less likely to be we're less likely to be lifers at a place, but we are loyal to people. So I have a lot of people who I've worked with at a lot of different places because we work well together and we're loyal to each other as a team. And whereas I don't know anyone really who's my age who's been somewhere for more than 5 years.
Well, I'd like to say if you could take out Gen X from the conversation and dump any other generation into it, I think you might have some very similar reactions from older generations. And of course, the baby boomers are always being pitted against the Gen Xers. Well, we were your parents, but apart from that. And I think everyone's had to adapt to this rolling tide of change in jobs and families and in media and analog, digital, and who knows what's next. So I think it's smart to be adaptive, and one may long for some of what we left behind with print newspapers or print media, but then we look forward to what are the exciting new things? And that's what makes life so interesting and challenging, and why the baby boomers haven't fallen off the face of the earth, left behind in their dungeon of papers and typewriters and rotary phones. I mean, everybody's adapting, and it actually, in some ways, is really good for the mind. We talked about the body, but mentally, all of the stimulation and games for the mind, all that Candy Crush and whatever, is actually beneficial. So to look at the upside, it's you're not really sure what's going on, and it's different, but different can also be a stimulus for growth in a way that you may not be able to see when you're in the middle of it.
I will say, though, that even if it's not true that Generation X, and I don't think it's true that Generation X is way behind millennials as far as being able to, do Snapchat or whatever it is, there's a perception that we are. And you see that again and again. There was just a CNBC article about how 51% of global leaders right now are Generation X, but they're the slowest group to be promoted and to advance. And the article was saying that baby boomers are sticking around and millennials are leapfrogging over them. And a lot of it is because of this perception that millennials are the ones you want to call on when you have to put together the project on the internet or whatever it is that you think they're going to know better than these 40-year-olds.
Which isn't necessarily an accurate perception.
It might not be. I'm not,
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, my research shows that it's not an accurate
it's not
perception.
accurate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really not. There's a variety of different levels of technical competence in Gen X, because some of us started on computers when we were little kids, programming, not simply using, but actually programming.
Yeah, but most of what we learned was essentially useless.
Sure, sure, but learning the tools of programming, learning how
See,
the machine language works.
You learned how to play
This
Oregon
is a bit
Trail.
of a tangent, but I would have rather they had let us stay in shop class and learn something legitimate. Although you have to be a computer science to work on a car engine anyway and these days. But I want to without getting in too much of a baby boomer fight. You said that boomers and the baby boomers are constantly being pitted against Gen X, and I think that's, for one thing, that's not a fair fight, because as Ada said, the baby boomers are just refusing to leave the stage. I have a book about Gen X coming out in a few months, and the gal who took my picture for the thing was a millennial, and she said, "What's your book about?" And I explained, and she said, "Oh yeah, Gen X, what's that again?" And so I explained to her what it was, and she said, "Oh yeah, I know, you're the generation that's not going to get a president." And I'm like, she's probably right, isn't she? I mean, the next president could very well be another baby boomer, right? And then what? Then we're all going to be this millennial wave that's pushing up is taking all the oxygen out of the room, and there's absolutely none left for us. So that's my thing.
It's time to take a stand.
Other questions?
Good Lord, you guys have made me feel so dismal about being an Xer.
Aw.
Okay, so a couple of main questions for Ada, but it's also a few comments. This is a very interesting discussion. I'm an Xer. My parents, I guess, would be boomers. My sister is a Yer, right? Remember the Y, right before the millennials, right? So it's kind of interesting in my house because there's 8 years between my sister and I. But Ada, you said something interesting about perimenopausal. I have to be honest, I don't know much about it either. I guess I should learn. But I guess I'm a little concerned about some of the language used around that subject, because I'm afraid that it could then be used against us, particularly in the workplace.
Right.
Oh my gosh, she's emotional. She's
Yeah.
volatile. She's going through it. She's got kids. She's got 2 kids. I mean, I literally was sitting, I won't give names, but with an investment manager that was telling me that it was difficult for him to find diversity and inclusion, particularly with women, because he goes, we travel and it's hard. It's hard. My boss and I were both sitting there really? We're here? So I get concerned about some of the language used. Can you just talk about how how to balance that and be real about the issues, but at the same time not make us look weak?
Right. It's
Thank you.
No, it's a really good question. It's a really hard question, because the truth is that period of time before menopause is fraught. It's really fraught if you have a family, and it's really fraught if you have a female body, and it's a difficult time. And I think the solution has been to just pretend it's not true, to pretend that male bodies and female bodies, for the purposes of everything, are the same, just as capable of everything. And I think that it is, I don't know, I mean, I'm honestly stumped, because I think we have to be able to talk about it, and I think the workplace has to somehow adapt to the fact that this is a hard time, and I'm not sure what that means. I think it has something to do with flexibility. I think this insistence on no flex time, on no leave, it preferences men who are not primary caregivers for their children. It preferences people who are not going to take care of their aging parents, their boomer parents, who we love.
Thank you. It makes me feel better. Well, I think one other point, though, and I'm not sure if I'm kind of sidestepping the issue now of how Gen X defines itself and deals with its kind of lack of recognition. But I did want to say, to Matthew's point, I was being kind of like putting air quotes around pinning against, but in reality, there's a lot of intergenerational flow downward from older generations to younger generations, and I don't really like generalizing entire generations, so I don't really like to say baby boomers, and I really don't like boomers, because I don't know what that means, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we have these divisions, is that they're there to help you as well. And I think there's a lot of interest that older adults have in their kids and their grandkids. It's actually, there's a term for it, intergenerational stake, and it's not stake in the heart. It's actually the concern you have about your own children and your children's children. And so if there's any kind of soothing thought to have about this, is that the parents and grandparents are really there to be called on, and I think want to, more so, and maybe are more able to do so more than in previous generations.
I thought of something else. It's powerful to be mad all the time and to be frustrated. I think there is a source of power in this perimenopausal annoyance with the world. I talked to one friend of mine who just went through it, and I was like, did you do hormone replacement or anything? And she said, no, because my attitude was, everyone else needs to be medicated around me so they will not be so annoying. And I think there was something kind of profound in that. I think there is an opportunity in this period of time where you are frustrated and you are going through all these changes, and the opportunity is to look around and see what needs to be fixed and what needs to change. So I don't think that's weakness. I think it's a period of time that's good for analysis.
So following up on that question, one of the things that we've talked about is what to do. So I want to ask you all, what can people do to address these things in their own lives? And
I don't know if I should be giving anyone advice about anything, but I think the only thing, I think we all have our coping mechanisms, but I think that when I mentor a lot of people who've I've worked with for a long time, and I've seen their careers grow, and there are people who are 10 years younger than me who I've worked with for a long time in different capacities, and when they're going through something hard, I tell them these, I give them a lot of platitudes, and sometimes they're true. So, and one of the things is to do more of what you love, and think about what you like doing through the course of a day, and not I think we worry a lot about big picture stuff and a lot about the future, and sometimes it helps just to take a step back and be like, what does my perfect day look like? How can I get through today so at the end of the day I'm I've had a great day? And that comes down to just being at 8 a.m. I want to do this, I would like my day to play out like this, and just to do more of what you like doing and try to cope. I don't know. I'm bad at advice. So yeah, just do more of what you love, maybe win the lottery, I'm not really sure. Yeah.
Susan?
I think I would say that when the stress and anxiety and depression really reach a point where they are significant in your life, whatever your age. To call it a midlife crisis, I think, kind of devalues that experience and shoves it aside. And when people are experiencing the stresses that you've talked about, talking about them, and then finding a way out of this or through this by, if necessary, getting professional help, doing more reading Ada's book, reading my book, reading Matthew's book, and drinking more wine,
Yeah.
and finding finding ways to really make meaning out of this experience and not trivialize it. I really would hate to see this to happen, that it becomes discounted and made fun of and just a joke, because midlife crisis has become kind of a really easy joke, a gotcha comment. And I really would like to see the term evolve into something that will be more suggestive and more descriptive and maybe more hopeful.
Matthew?
Well, I mean, I'm tempted to, I think there's some concrete things that you could do that I think that would make me feel, not things that you could do that would make me feel this way, but things that I do that make me feel like the world that is not, spiraling out of control. My daughter's 14, and we bought her a typewriter. And this thing is like it's like some kind of a magical talisman. It's like a time machine thing. It feels so good to press those buttons. It's like there's a lot of memories there. And I know people will accuse me when I talk about these things of like having some just like nostalgia thing for 1985 or something. But what I'm sort of pushing here is like a pumping of the brakes. And I've been very cheered over the last 6 months by what I mentioned earlier, which is this sort of like growing realization that there's a great book by this technology critic, Nicholas Carr. The title of it is Utopia is Creepy. And I think there's definitely a feeling like whatever world we are just sort of like heading for full speed is a little bit creepy, and maybe we don't need, I know this is a very sophisticated audience here, but maybe we don't need like an Amazon Echo in every room listening to our conversations all day long and spying on our comings and goings to help us like get our toilet paper faster or whatever. Like, we might not need that, and so, get a typewriter, subscribe to the Wall Street Journal or newspaper of your choice, and maybe put down the phone. That's what I think. That's what I do.
Ada?
Well, I think anywhere that, as far as women go, anywhere that we can get more support. I think if men can be a little nicer and do a little more childcare, that really goes a long way toward making this whole thing much easier. And workplaces and healthcare, all those sorts of things. I would say personally for each of us, I think writing a new story for ourselves is one of the most important things you can do in midlife. So this article was kind of a fluke for me. I write a lot of personal essays for the New York Times, and one I expanded into a memoir, which is downstairs. I just saw it by the cash register. It's called Wedding Toasts I'll Never Give. It was a memoir about my marriage. And one thing that I've noticed in the reaction to that book and in teaching memoir is there is something really powerful about telling your story in a way where you are the hero of your story and where you face obstacles and you overcome them. And it's called like a redemptive narrative in narrative psychology. It's incredibly powerful to say what things mean and to say what comes next. And writing it lets you write the next chapter in a conscious way, I think. You don't have to actually write it down and publish a memoir, but just either writing out for yourself or doing it in your head and just assigning meaning to stories, I think that gets you a long way.
Thank you. So we have a few more minutes for questions.
Hi, so I'm 19, I'm currently in college, I guess considered Generation Z, I believe. I don't even know anything.
End of millennials.
Okay.
Tell us more, and then I'll be able to diagnose.
He said
98.
Generation.
Well, no, just more about yourself.
End of
More about
millennials, yeah.
myself, great
Yeah.
hair. No, so I'm in college right now, and I know a lot of us, I can speak for a lot of people that I talk to about this, is we look up to the millennials, and see not a lazy generation, but we see what a lot of baby boomers see. And I feel like there's a bit of pressure on my generation, at least, to try to beat that. And I was wondering if you saw this in an upcoming workforce about a lot of people trying to beat the stereotypes that is the generation that preceded us. And I was wondering how I could deal with this in the workplace.
I have a comment about that. Well, first of all, you're technically kind of a millennial still. Sorry. But also, today I happened to write a blog in my Psych Today blog that not all millennials are narcissists. And I think, millennials could be sitting up here and really complaining. And it's, I have seen in my own teaching of college students your age that this is not everybody, but it's a group of people who do have a strong sense of social justice. People are fighting for things on campuses that they hadn't fought for in 30 or 40 years, and they're very public service oriented. There are more service learning courses on campus now than there ever were, and there are students who want these experiences to go abroad, join the Peace Corps, get a Fulbright scholarship, go teach English. Then I've ever seen. So I think it's not right to call a generation something, but if you're going to call them something, don't call them something bad, especially if they're starting out in life and you want to have hope. So I would say the hope is that, well, sorry, you're still a millennial, but B, you're probably a good person still.
So yes, every generation looks to the generation before it. And every generation before it complains about the generation coming after. I had to walk uphill both ways in the snow in Southern California to get to school. And you don't. Happens every generation. I've seen this cycle since, boomers and then Xers and now millennials. I'm starting to hear it about the next group, which nobody has a really good name for yet. They're calling it Gen Z. But this is a life cycle thing, and you'll experience it, and you'll get through it, because the rest of us did too. Mostly.
It's called generational old fogeyism.
Yeah, that's actually what it's called.
And it happens with places too, I think. The book I wrote before this last one was called St. Mark's is Dead, and it was a history of the street I grew up on. And every generation I interviewed, the generation before them was invisible to them. They were like, oh, we came here, nothing was going on, and then we just brought this wonderful culture. And then the generation that came after was annoying. So it's like invisible before and then annoying after.
It's unprecedented to have annoying and annoying on both sides.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. Because of comments earlier, I felt compelled to share maybe a little bit of positive story as someone at the higher end of this generation, because I just went through this experience where all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I picked up and moved my family after 21 years in San Francisco to a new city and accepted a job that is literally my dream job, all I've ever talked about since I was 20-something.
Congratulations.
And have had the most awesome year this last year. Not pretending, there's plenty of challenges left. My parents here have to manage the guilt and the constant going back and caring with them and for them. No, marriage is not perfect, no Facebook fantasy or anything, but just the change the narrative part was really eye-opening, because it took, I think, 10 or 15 people to talk me into taking my dream job, including my husband, which I can't believe now when I look back on it how hard it was for me to say, yes, I should do this. Why wouldn't I do this? And so I think that's really powerful.
That's great, and it's a great testament to how valuable it is to have a network that's supporting you. And I think a lot of women don't have that, either in their partner or their friends. And I think it's a great testament to that as a real
And to
value.
make changes instead of just sticking with the comfortable, straight and narrow.
Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering how overscheduling of children's activities played into the crisis. Because that seems to be unique for our generation relative to the baby boomers.
Well, there was this line in the story about how this grandmother was saying, why do you play with them, to her daughter, about the children of this Gen X woman. We never played with you. Why do you have to do that? And personally, I think we grew up in this landscape of kids on milk cartons, this incredibly high murder rate, Eton Pates was in my neighborhood growing up. And there was a real fear, a well-founded fear, that we lived with, and yet we were latchkey kids, and we roamed free among all of these degenerates. I think that we saw a lot as kids, and at least for my part, I don't want my child to go through what I went through. And I'm willing to sacrifice a certain amount of independence for him in order to have him in karate and have him in drama and do all that. It does put more on us. Like, I think our parents, they were having cocktails and smoking. What? Not all of them, but there was a certain.
Can't do that.
A certain. After this, there was a certain more hands-off attitude, and I think in response, even though the cities are much safer now, the murder rate's way down. I think we've responded to that in a kind of controlling way.
Okay. I think, did we have one more question?
We're okay. Oh, okay.
I was going to make a comment to, I guess, respond to something somebody else had said. One thing that I've found is that as a woman in the workplace, I was influenced by my math teacher being really upset that the ERA didn't pass. Mm-hmm. And I looked at all these pioneers who were ahead of us in the baby boom generation and always felt like I had to hide that I was pregnant. Mm-hmm. And then I come and I see these millennials who are demanding a lactation room. And sometimes, I think, get a life. But on the other hand, great for them for demanding what's right. And so, I think, to respond to the woman who was talking about, should we talk about menopause? Well, yes and no, right? I mean, Sally Krawczak had this opinion piece about somebody who told her, well, do you know how hard it is to talk to financial advisors? And, she run one of the largest financial advisory firms in the world. So, I don't know, I just feel like at the, as a Gen Xer, as a woman in the workplace, as a full-time worker with, with kids, with husbands who have crazy jobs that take them all over. I mean, it really is sort of this crunch generation where sometimes we have good role models in the baby boom generation, and sometimes we have baby boomers who have no idea about how our life is because they've, gone a different path. So that's all I wanted to say.
I have something to say about the thing they're talking about, the things at work and worrying about being perceived as weak. I went to this panel in March at South by Southwest, and it was about how to change the culture in a workplace and how to create more diversity when you are not the decision maker. And the CEO of TaskRabbit said this amazing thing and this idea has stuck with me, and I've told my team at work, and they think I'm nuts because I'm not articulating it correctly. But it's the idea is that to create change in the workplace, if you are not the one in charge of making the decisions, is that you need a gang of 3. 3 is a coalition, but it's also a community. So if you can identify 2 other people in your workplace that you trust, who you share an agenda with, and if you ask for a meeting of 3 people with someone who can make a change for you for the better, you're more likely to have influence. Because if you're just one, you feel alone, and it's scary, and it puts you in a vulnerable position. And if it's 2, it feels like just 2, but 3 feels substantial.
Well, thank you all very much for spending the last hour with us. And we'll be here to answer a couple of questions, I think, if you have any. Thank you.